So, I've had the pleasure of speaking for you for My Health Angel. How many times now? Over the last, I
A
guess,
lot.
what about a year or two? About 2 years. So a lot. So I recognize a lot of faces and names on the screen, and always enjoy this, and hope at some point we'll be able to meet one another in person. Um, so with that said, today is inspiring women from history. So I wanted to put a list of 10 of my heroines from history. So I made a list of about 30, and I decided, okay, who gets taken off the list? And I couldn't. I got it down to 25, and I thought I'll do 25, and I thought, no, that'll take 3 hours. So I eventually said I got to get it down to 10. I think I got it to 15 or 16, and I gave up. So it's not a nice round number, but I tried to pick women from different periods in history, from different backgrounds, some that you know, some that you don't know, and also women whose contributions to the world were made in all sorts of different ways. But all these are folks that I've always been drawn to myself. So let's celebrate strong women with Nicole and Ashley, shall we, everybody? Okay, so let's get started. Got to start with Martha. Martha Washington. So always been a big fan of Martha's. I've always said, and as somebody who's written a book on George Washington, if there was no Martha, there never would have been a George. Now, unfortunately, Martha's presented to us very simplistically, monolithically, as this grandmotherly figure there on the left, sort of a Betty Crocker meets Mrs. Santa Claus, kind of a hybrid. She always has her little signature white bonnet on and her apron, and she looks like she never wants to have her painting done, which is true. She hated sitting for paintings. Martha was an intensely private individual. So, unfortunately, history only remembers the grandmotherly Martha through that image that you see on the left. We don't remember the teenage Martha on the right. Look at her posture. Look at that. She has a Cheshire cat, almost a Mona Lisa enigmatic look about her, like she knows something. She looks confident. She looks active. She looks smart. So Martha was all that. We just know her from the picture on the left. Unfortunately, Martha burned almost all of George Washington's letters to her when George died on December 14th, 1799. She also destroyed a lot of her own letters before her own passing in early May of 1802. So we don't have a good broad perspective of her. About 157 of her letters survive. There's one quote from her that is the only quote that ever gets reprinted. And it's a very cute quote, but I don't like it because it presents an inaccurate view of Martha. The one quote that remains of her, she was asked to describe herself, and she said, quote unquote, I'm an old fashioned Virginia housekeeper, busy as a bee, steady as a clock, cheerful as a cricket. That's cute, but it doesn't really present Martha. Martha was a dynamo. She was tough. Martha spent, well, for example, let's take the image on the right. When she was a teenager, her family was, today we would say, upper middle class, but she was courted by some sons of the wealthiest aristocrats in the colony. And we have a story that one gentleman rode up to her house on horseback and hollered out for her father, who walked out on the front porch. And the man is telling the father he wanted permission to court Martha. Martha, the man never gets off the horse. Martha hears this. She walks out on the porch, walks up to the horse, and has him bend down toward her and slaps him across the face and says, "Get off your horse if you want to court me." So Martha was fiery and capable. As a young woman, she's married to one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. She has 4 kids. Her 2 oldest kids, her husband, her father, and her husband's father all die within a very short period of time, leaving her in charge of one of the largest plantations and businesses as a young widow with little kids. Martha somehow pulls it together and not only thrives, but prospers in that. Now, Martha visited George every winter of the Revolutionary War. This starts in spring of 75 and ends in fall of 1783, so that's a lot of winters. Now, that may not sound like a very bold or dramatic thing, but remember, everybody, Martha is traveling hundreds of miles in an open carriage on unpaved roads in the winter, no GPS through enemy territory. This says something. She arrives in camp, and what does she do? Alexander Hamilton, Washington's right hand man, once wrote that when Martha arrived in camp, he wrote, quote unquote, "Thank goodness Lady Washington has arrived in camp. The good general has been inconsolable. Now we can finally get down to the matter of winning the war." What does that mean? How could Martha win the war? Well, she propped up George's spirits. She cooked for the army. She was tireless day and night in sewing uniforms, making scarves, knitting scarves, mending socks. She held the hands of dying soldiers. She read the letters to them from their family and helped them compose letters. We cannot overstate, I believe, the importance of the presence of a kindly grandmotherly figure in a camp of young boys who'd never been away from home, who were scared to death and weren't sure if they were going to live and die through the winter or live through the winter. So Martha really nurtured, comforted the army. We have a cute letter from a young girl who was excited that George Washington's camp was in her hometown one winter. So in the winters, they largely stopped fighting the wars. So the young girl and a friend are excited to go to camp because there's going to be a party, a ball in the camp, and she'll meet all the dashing officers and soldiers. Most importantly, they're going to meet Alexander Hamilton, a colonel who was, the most handsome person of the time. So the women are excited about that, and they're writing back and forth. Well, a letter from one of the two women survives the war, and what she said is she showed up at camp and she thought before she went to look for Hamilton and go to the dance, she ought to give her respects to Lady Washington, who was presiding at the event. She couldn't find Martha. She finally finds her in a small room. Martha's in there sewing and knitting, repairing uniforms, making socks and scarves for the soldiers. The young woman introduced herself and asked what she could do, and Martha told her to pull up a chair. The poor young girl said she worked all night mending uniforms, never got to go to the party. But that was Martha. That's Martha's contribution. So Martha was an amazing woman. In marrying Martha, it put George on the political, economic, and social map because she was a leading figure in society. Washington was an uneducated, untraveled colonial aide, not even a regular officer. She was, as George always called her, his worthy partner. So Martha was an impressive person and had a remarkable life. Um, Really comforted George in the army. She, in retirement, she would, if a soldier was destitute, she would open up her heart and her purse and give them money. Uh, Cared for soldiers, cooked for them. So really a remarkable person. Second person on my list, Laura Secord. We have any Canadians in the audience? If you're a Canadian, you know her. She's a heroine of Canada. If you go to Canada today, there's one of my favorites, a Laura Secord chocolate company. They make delicious chocolates and fudge. So if Nicole and Ashley or any of you, if you go to Canada, pick up some Laura Secord fudge for me and bring it back. Love Laura Secord fudge. There's been postage stamps with her face on it. There's a statue of her in front of the National Capitol in Canada. There's streets named after her. She's quite the hero. And on the left is a very flattering image that an artist imagined. On the right is her late in life. So here's the story. She was actually born in Massachusetts, and her husband was a loyalist. That is, he supported the crown in Britain. So when the Revolutionary War began, he moved to Canada in opposition of the Patriots trying to get rid of the crown, the British. That husband fights in the War of 1812, and they live near Niagara Falls, and that area is under assault by the Americans. The Americans try to invade Canada about 7 times. This is why it's horrific what we did. This is why the textbooks don't write about the War of 1812, because we were the aggressor, we were the belligerent, and we acted wholly like a bunch of Vikings marauding. Anyways, we invade the Niagara area at the Battle of Queenston Heights, as it's called. And Laura Secord's husband almost dies in that battle. He's wounded. She has him back at the home, nursing for him, caring for him and her young children. The Americans win and they're going to march through Canada. This is the invasion that's going to remove Canada. But what the Americans do is they commandeer Laura Secord's house. And the officers demand that she cook for them and that they sleep at the house. So now she has a dying husband she's caring for, children. She has to slaughter all the family's animals, get everything they have, all the extras for the year, and prepare meals for all the British officers. So she does that all night long. The officers don't think about it, so they talk openly in front of Laura Secord about their plans for invading Canada. So she knows exactly where they're going to go, when they're going to go there, and what they're going to do. So when all the officers fall asleep, she walks all night long by herself through Mohawk Indian Territory, through the woods, to try to find the British. She finds a lieutenant named Fitzgibbons after walking literally all night long, miles through the woods. She tells Fitzgibbons where the Americans are coming, when, and what they're going to do. The British get a few Mohawks allies, some Canadian militiamen, and a few British soldiers. They're outgunned, outnumbered, outmanned, but they know what's happening. They line up and they ambush the Americans and slaughter the Americans who turn back and leave Canada. Laura Secord saves Canada. So that's why she's the great hero in Canada today. Mary Pickersgill. She looks like a Pickersgill, doesn't she? That's Mary Pickersgill. This is also a story from the War of 1812. So Mary Pickersgill has a rough life. She loses siblings and her mother at a young age. She marries and a husband and children die. She marries again. That husband during the war is guarding an arms depot and it blows up and he's killed. Mary Pickersgill's mother, however, was a seamstress who taught Mary how to knit, sew, make clothing, make flags, all sorts of things. She's kind of a Betsy Ross type of figure. And she's really good at sewing five-pointed stars and making flags. So what happens during the War of 1812 is in 1812 and 1813, the Americans pretty much get beaten in almost every battle. It's a disastrous war. Then 1814 comes around. So the Americans, despite having numerical advantage, get whooped almost every battle. Now by 1814, the British have finished with Napoleon in Europe. So the British sail an armada, a flotilla of warships filled with soldiers to America. They're going to invade America. They're going to invade America from Canada, from New Orleans, and right smack in the middle, Baltimore and Washington. So one of the targets the British have is Washington, D.C. And on August 24th, 1814, they march into Washington, D.C. Embarrassingly, they whoop us, our men run, and they burn Washington, D.C. They burn the White House, the Capitol, the Treasury, the War Department. They burn the shipyards, the Library of Congress. Everything is burned. Then the British head for what they believe to be an even more important target, Baltimore. Why? Even though Washington, D.C. is our capital, it's a small town, it's a backwater, very few people live there. Baltimore is one of the biggest, most important cities. It's one of the most important seaports. He who controls Baltimore controls the Chesapeake. Baltimore has a lot of privateers. We didn't have much of a navy, so what you do is you license a shipping captain to basically be a pirate and harass British ships, and they call them privateers. They're out of Baltimore, and Baltimore has Fort McHenry. Anybody heard of Fort McHenry? Anybody been there? There we go. Susan has. A couple of you have. So Fort McHenry is one of our largest forts. It has a lot of our powder, armaments, musket balls. In other words, without Fort McHenry, it's going to be hard to fight a war. It has so much there. So the British are going to burn Baltimore to the ground and destroy Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry is minimally garrisoned. There's not a lot of men there. It's not led by a general or a colonel, only a major, a young guy named Armistead. Armistead is in a panic. He hears rumors that the people of Baltimore and the military are going to flee because there's no stopping the British. So he approaches Mary Pickersgill and he tells her to make the largest flag in the country. It's 30 feet high by 42 feet long. And he wants this massive flag. She and her daughter and a maid and a couple of nieces all spend days and days and days in a warehouse, and they make the largest flag. And they give it to Major Armistead. The purpose is he's going to fly that flag on the top of Fort McHenry to inspire the people in the fort, and the flag is so big that people in Baltimore nearby will be able to see it. So the British arrive, and we have two crusty old Revolutionary veterans by the name of Smith and Stricker. And they tell the people of Baltimore, don't evacuate. We're not going to surrender the city. We're going to fight. Here's what we're going to do, though. He got every available boat, and they sunk them all at the entrance to Baltimore. Today, Inner Harbor, if anybody's been to Inner Harbor, they sunk the boat. So now the British cannot sail into Baltimore. They have to drop anchor outside of the harbor and shell the fort and shell the city from a distance. Then what Smith and Stricker said, we're going to get all the lanterns in Baltimore and we're going to hang them from trees in the woods outside of Baltimore. So at night when the British arrive, they target the lanterns so they're blowing up the trees and not the city. Then they got bucket brigades to put out any fire to save the city, and they're going to fight back. Inside Fort McHenry, Armistead flies this massive flag and tells the men to prepare. All night long, from dusk until dawn, it was arguably the largest bombardment at the time in North America. They're going to bomb Baltimore and Fort McHenry and reduce the fort to rubble, which means we can't fight back. Now, before the British started bombing, however, they captured a fellow named Dr. Beans. Dr. Beans was a Scotsman who flipped sides and supported America. He treated British soldiers and officers, but when he treated them, he spied on them. So the British learned about it, and General Robert Ross and Admiral Cockburn captured Dr. Beans, and they brought him on board the British flagship, the HMS Tonnant. And there they were going to try him after the bombardment and then sentence him to death for treason and espionage. So Dr. Beans is on the ship's anchor, and they're ready to start their all-night bombardment. However, Dr. Beans was friends with President James Madison. So people scramble, and the president scrambles, and they send a lawyer and part-time poet out to the ship to beg for Dr. Beans's release. The name of that lawyer and poet, Francis Scott Key. He goes out to the ship and he argues, and they agree to let Dr. Beans go, but they said not until the morning, because you've heard too much, you know what we're going to do tonight. You have to stay on board the ship and watch as we destroy Baltimore and the fort. Then we'll release you in the morning. So all night long, Francis Scott Key and Dr. Beans walked the deck of the ship, watching the rocket's red glare, watching the bombs bursting in air, right, everybody? In hopes that in the morning that our flag would still be what? There. And in the morning they looked up, and there was flying the Stars and Stripes herself, the massive flag that Mary Pickersgill had sewn. It was on top of the fort. The fort withstood the bombardment, as did Baltimore. The British were so shocked and embarrassed, they sailed away. Dr. Beans and Francis Scott Key went free, and they were so inspired by Mary Pickersgill's flag that Francis Scott Key wrote a poem about it. And we didn't have a national anthem. So everybody liked the poem so much, "Oh, say can you see," that they decided to make it our national anthem. So that's Mary Pickersgill. Sojourner Truth. Anybody heard of Sojourner Truth? Good. Jill has heard of her. A couple of you have. Sojourner Truth was a great orator and advocate for ending slavery in the 1800s. You might say she was the female Frederick Douglass, a great speaker like him. Now, Sojourner Truth's real name was Isabel Baumfree. Baum. She grew up in a Dutch part of New York City. Dutch was her first language. So she didn't speak English with a Southern slave dialect. She spoke it with a Dutch accent, which people thought was strange. Poor Isabel Bumfree, she had a horrible life. Her slave owner beat her and raped her. She had children with him, and then he sold her to another slave owner who beat her and raped her, and she had children with that slave owner, who sold her to a third slave owner who beat her and raped her, and she had children with him. She met a slave named Robert that she wanted to marry, but the slave owner's wife would not let her marry. The slave owner's wife was so angry that her husband kept raping Sojourner, Isabel Bumfree, that she wouldn't allow her to marry the man she loved and instead ordered that that slave be beaten and he was killed. He died. Sojourner Truth finally decided, I'm going to leave. I'm going to escape. She took one child with her, a daughter, and she escaped. After she escaped, she changed her name from Isabel Bumfree to Sojourner Truth. What a great name, right, everybody? Yeah, I need to change my name. It's too common. So she became Sojourner Truth. And she was probably the first black woman that most Northerners ever heard speak. She was arguably the first black woman as a featured speaker at public events that anybody had ever heard. She was known for delivering in Ohio a famous speech called Ain't I a Woman? Ain't I a Woman? And she gave that speech at a women's event to try to promote women's rights. And the speech goes something like this. She used a musical cadence, kind of like Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King. She also kept coming back to a theme, like King would say, you know, the amber waves of grain, I have a dream. The stone mountains of Georgia, I have a dream. Until all children can sit at the table of brotherhood, I have a dream. She would say, ain't I a woman? So she would say, they say that women are too weak to do this and that, but these hands have picked fields of cotton. Ain't I a woman? They say women are too weak to get rights or to participate in this and that, but these hips have borne 11 children. Ain't I a woman? They say women are too fragile to do this and that, but I have been beaten repeatedly for years, and here I am. Ain't I a woman? So she gave this famous speech, and she raised awareness to end slavery and was a popular speaker all across the North. Um, and later in life, she became the first black woman to successfully win a lawsuit. She found out that one of her sons had been taken to Alabama, and she sued the white slave owner and actually won during the days of slavery. Unbelievable. So Sojourner Truth had a great legacy for making people aware of the evils and horrors of slavery. Elizabeth Van Lew. This is also during the Civil War. So her house is on the right. There's Elizabeth on the left. She was a Quaker whose family were abolitionists. They were against slavery and they came from Philadelphia. However, the father moved to Richmond, lovely city. I love Richmond. That's her mansion, which no longer is there. Around 1901, it was torn down. But her mansion sat up on a hill overlooking the James River in what is today a lovely neighborhood in Richmond. At any rate, so the father dies, leaves everything to her. She's probably the wealthiest resident of Richmond. And Elizabeth Van Lew buys slaves and then frees them. She becomes a strong abolitionist. Many of them don't know where to go because Richmond is the capital of the Confederacy. So she has them live in her mansion, but live free, and she pays them and treats them as family or workers. Now, Elizabeth Van Lew does another great deed. Richmond is the capital of the Confederacy, and there are prisons in Richmond, including one called Libby, which has high-ranking officers, and one called Belle Isle for enlisted men. And they're just charnel houses. Men are dying there. The South is torturing them. They're just slaughtering their Union brothers. So what she does is she becomes a spy. They call her Crazy Bet. Why Crazy Bet? One, because she never married. Two, she believed in women's equality. Three, she didn't like slavery. And four, she acted crazy. Why? Because she could get inside the prisons and slip intelligence and information to all the Union prisoners, because no one in a genteel South would expect a woman, much less an older, crazy woman, crazy Bet. So what she does is she has money, so even though everybody in Richmond's starving, she can procure food. She would cook fresh delights and take them to the prison. The prison guards were starving, so she would tell them, I will give you some delicious fresh baked pastries if you allow me to give some to the prisoners. The guards, of course, said yes, because they're starving and they're smelling those fresh goods. Then, when she would give the Union prisoners food, she not only kept them alive, but she would plant notes inside the food. In fact, General Benjamin Butler and General Ulysses Grant even taught her how to write with a codex. She could decrypt and encrypt her messages and slip them to the generals and slip them to the soldiers. She even wrote in lemon juice with milk. When you heat it up, your writing becomes not invisible, but visible. So she knew all the secrets and tricks, and she fed the officers intelligence so they knew when they were going to escape, the best time to do it, where the closest Union lines were, how to make it to her house. She got them food, she got them socks. And in February 9th, 1864, the largest prison break in American history occurs from the Libby prison in Richmond when 109 Union officers broke out. And they did so thanks to Crazy Bet, Elizabeth Van Lew. After the war, when Grant becomes president, he makes her a postmaster general. So she has a job and an income. Former prisoners that escaped would send her money. One of them was Paul Revere's grandson. So she lived a long and wonderful life as a spy deep inside the Confederate capital, keeping men alive. She saved lives. Crazy Bet. Victoria Woodhull. So here's my question for everybody. Are you ready? When did the first woman run for president of the United States? The answer, 1872. And the person was Victoria Woodhull. You're looking at her. She was young. She was attractive. She wrote her own book, self-taught lawyer, and was the first woman to have a brokerage on Wall Street. So she was a trailblazer. Victoria Woodhull was advocating what she called free love. Her argument was it's okay for men to enjoy physical intimacies, but not for women. It's okay for men to have affairs, but not for women. And if a man wants to do it, a woman can't say no. So she was an early advocate for women's rights, sexual liberation, and so forth, free love. Problem was, every time she went out to speak about free love, she was arrested, heckled, mistreated. So she said, enough is enough. I'm going to run for president. And in 1872, at age 34, she ran for president. Now, the Constitution in Article 2 says you need to be 35. She ran nonetheless. The problem for her, whenever she tried to campaign, she was arrested. When she tried to register to vote, she was arrested. And when she tried to vote for herself on election day, she was arrested. But Victoria Woodhull really promotes the women's agenda, becomes an impressive, outspoken advocate for all sorts of rights for women. By the way, when she ran for president, her vice presidential running mate was none other than Frederick Douglass, the great former slave orator. Now, neither political party would let her run in 1872, so she ran on a third party, an equal rights party ticket. Victoria Woodhull. Carrie Chapman Catt. Been a big fan of hers for years. Probably no one did more to assure the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote in 1920, than Carrie Chapman Catt. Triple C. So what happened was, by the 1860s and 1870s, the women's movement was in a rift. It had a big split between the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association. One was younger, more reform-oriented women that favored family planning and abortion rights. The other was older, more conservative women that opposed family planning and abortion rights. The conservative group was led by Susan B. Anthony. The progressive group was led by Lucy Stone. But what happens is that really creates a rift in the women's movement, so it looks like they're not going to get the right to vote, a ratification of an amendment to the Constitution. Carrie Chapman Catt, I'll just talk about two things for the sake of time. One, she's the one who heals the rift and brings together both the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association, creating a new organization, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So she heals the rift and keeps everybody focused on the prize. Secondly, what she says, instead of trying to amend the Constitution, which is hard to do, how do we amend the Constitution, everybody? You need 2/3 of the House and Senate, and then you need 3/4 of the states to ratify. You all remember that, right? We all went to school when we still taught civics. Now they have standardized tests. They don't do a dang thing. So she said it's really hard to ratify, to amend the Constitution. We've only done it 27 times in well over 200 years. And the first 10 were in one fell swoop, as the Bill of Rights. One was prohibition, and another one was to overturn prohibition. So if you think of it that way, we really only had 15 amendments, other than those 12, in all these years. So what Carrie Chapman Catt says, instead of trying to amend the Constitution, let's try to get women the right to vote in just one state. That'll be easier. And if we get it in one state, now we have a model we can use for other states. Plus, when we try to amend the Constitution, we're going to need all those states anyway. And a lot of conservatives and preachers and men were fear-mongering, as they often do, saying if women get the right to vote, they will never marry, they won't have children, and that'll be the end of the human race. Don't they always exaggerate and use blame and fear? So she said, if we get the right to vote in one state, we can show people that we don't have horns and everything is fine. So that's a brilliant idea. So now they have to pick a state. So you'd think that they would pick what? New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island. No. She said, let's look at Idaho, the Wyoming Territory, Colorado, Utah. Let's look at the wild, wild West, conservative, bunch of cowboys running around. And they thought she was mad. Why would you try to get women's right to vote out there? She said, here's why. We have an asset. There's no women out there. Therefore, the men are desperate. So when she approached those Western states and said, would you give women the right to vote? If you do, and they said no. She said, but if you do, I will bring wagon loads of women out. So they all said, yeah, where do we sign? And she said, well, before we do that, in addition to getting the right to vote, we need the right to own land, to divorce, to custody, to inherit property, to appear in a court of law, to get a business license, to go to college. And the men out west said, sure, everything, anything you want. Where do we sign? They were desperate. So she brought wagon loads of women out there. Now, if you're a young woman at the time and you're getting divorced, today, a woman will 9 times out of 10 probably get primary custody of the kids. Back then, the man got it. In fact, it was so bad if a husband died, the courts might take young children and give them to his brother. Women couldn't appear in court. So what happened, a lot of young women that either lost their husbands, couldn't get a job, or were worried about a divorce, they fled out west where they had rights protecting them. There's not much competition. They could open up businesses. They could get an education. They could, go to court. So women went out, and Carrie Chapman Catt revolutionized it. Now, in 1912, they were excited because Woodrow Wilson was running for office, and they figured in 1912, Wilson is a former university president. He's the president of Princeton. And he said when he was campaigning, I want to finish the great Teddy Roosevelt's legacy. Teddy Roosevelt, 1901 to 1909, was a progressive, ran on a progressive party. They called it the Bull Moose. It was a liberal Democratic party, even though he was a Republican. He favored child labor laws, a woman having the right to vote, universal health care, regulations on food and product safety. So Wilson was going to finish his legacy, so women were excited. So women lined up in 1912 and 1913 for his campaign and his inauguration. You can see on the right of your screen, and they marched down the street in Washington because they knew with Wilson, they'd get the right to vote. Wilson won. They went to his inaugural, and he flip-flopped. Now he doesn't support women getting the right to vote. So after all that, with all those Western states lined up, ready to go, he flip-flops. Happily, something happened, which brings me to the next woman, Edith Bowling Galt. See the picture on the right? I mean, you don't see images like that of women from 100 years ago. Look how saucy she is. She's strong. She's confident. I mean, look at that pose. So Woodrow Wilson was elected in 1912, became president in 1913, but something happened. His wife, Ellen Axon, dies in office. So Wilson's a widower. He starts courting this woman called Edith Bowling Galt. There she is. Edith Bowling Galt was a widow also. Her husband was a jeweler who left her a lot of money. Now, not only was she a widow and the sitting president is courting her, but she was scandalous. She was tongues wagged about her all around Washington. Would you like to know why she was so scandalous, everybody? Sue Ellen, Susan, everybody, you good? Okay. So here's why she was so scandalous. She used to drive her own car. That was a giant scandal. She also went to Berna. She went to parties unescorted. That's how scandalous she was. So she comes into the White House, and there's a watch. The press can't get enough of her. In fact, they watch her enter and leave the White House at all hours of the day and night. In fact, there was a joke in Washington when World War I began. She was so shocked she fell out of the president's bed. That was the joke in Washington. They were once out courting, and there was a famous typo in the Washington newspaper. Mariana and Marion, Barbara, am I allowed to tell this story? Is it okay? I have permission? All right, good. Mariana, okay, you're giving me permission. So here it is. So they were out courting in a carriage, and the newspaper in Washington meant to write the following. The president was again seen entertaining the widow Galt in public. But there was a typo, and it said the president was again seen entering the widow Galt in public. So it created a huge scandal. Anyways, he marries her, and Edith tells him, you need to support women having the right to vote. So with Wilson now, he flipped again. Now he supports women having the right to vote. In 1920, the amendment passed, and women got the right to vote, in large measure thanks to Edith Bowling Galt and Carrie Chapman Catt. Next slide. Gertrude Elion. There she is, Gertrude. Gertrude's from New York. Family was Jewish from the Baltic states and Russia. They fled pogroms in Europe and came to America. Gertrude was an outstanding student. As a young girl, she was excellent in science and math, but girls are not supposed to like or be good in science and math. So she went to Hunter College, but graduates with straight A's. She wants to go get a master's and PhD, but no school would admit her for a master's or PhD. She has to work as a school secretary and a variety of jobs. Frustrated, eventually NYU allows her in and she gets a master's, but no one would let her get a PhD. So frustrated, she goes to work for the two men at the bottom of the screen there. Those two men are great scientists and researchers with this little startup company. You may have heard of it, Johnson and Johnson. And those two men develop a lot of medicines, vaccinations, cures, treatments, all sorts of things. And they win scientific prize after prize. They go down to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and they start up what we would call a bioengineering company, where they continue to churn out medicines and cures, and they win every prize there is. When the two and they take Gertrude with them, she's their lab assistant. What happens when those two men pass away, and this is why I love the picture at the bottom, when the two men pass away, the letters are available, and they realize, guess who it was that came up with all the medicines and cures? It was Gertrude. She wins the Nobel Prize for Medicine because of her great work. So in a day and age when women weren't supposed to be scientists or doctors, one of the great researchers for one of the great companies who has transformed our lives with medicines and cures was Gertrude Elion. Never married, by the way. Sacagawea. There she is on the right. So you all know Lewis and Clark, and there they are on the screen. Meriwether Lewis is the fellow with the tricorn cone hat. And Clark is the one with the raccoon skin hat. That's supposed to be Sacagawea with him. So in the early 1800s, Thomas Jefferson sends Lewis and Clark on what was the 1800s equivalent of the moonshot. They were going to cross this massive land to heretofore unknown parts and try to negotiate with Indians, map it all out, set up treaties, and find the elusive Northwest Passage. So Lewis and Clark set out. They were with a couple dozen men called the Corps of Discovery. And they did a remarkable job on the entire trip for years, all the way to the Pacific coast and back. They only lost one man, a sergeant named Floyd, who didn't die from any mistake or Indian conflict. His appendicitis burst. So they did a remarkable job. Clark was the big tough guy who could hunt, start a campfire, fight Indians, knew Indian dialects, navigate by the stars. He drew maps. That's Clark. Meriwether Lewis was an intellectual. He gathered plants and flowers, and like we all did when we were kids, put them in books. He got rock formations, studied the wildlife. He was Jefferson's secretary, an intellectual. So the two of them are headed out, and they're ready to get to the Rocky Mountains, and they set up camp for the winter at the Mandan Camp. The problem is they need supplies. They heard that there's mountains that stretch above the clouds and that it's freezing. They don't know how to get across it, so they decide they want to hire a guide at the Mandan Camp. The Mandans suggested a French fur trapper named Charbonneau. Charbonneau, however, was a drunk and a scoundrel and a liar. So they didn't like him. Clark was the one hiring a scout. Clark didn't like him. But Charbonneau had two young wives, Otter Woman and Sacagawea. She was sold to Charbonneau, and she was a little girl. And she was pregnant, about to give birth, even though she was just a teenager. Sacagawea had a terrible upbringing. She was captured in Indian raid after Indian raid and sold from one tribe to another. She was, beaten. She was basically a slave. But the good news to that is she traveled all across the West and knew a lot of Indian dialects. Clark was so impressed with this tough little girl and the way she gave birth that he kind of falls for her. So he hires Sacagawea, not Charbonneau, to be the guide for the mission. So she escorts Lewis and Clark across the Rockies to Indian Territory, a teenage girl with a little baby strapped to her back. Unbelievable. Charbonneau is so angry and jealous, in a drunken rage, he tries to attack her. Clark beats the hell out of Charbonneau and says, if you ever touch her again, I'll kill you. She manages to get Lewis and Clark to the west and all the way back. Think about the image for a potentially hostile Indian nation of a young girl with a baby at the front of this group of men. You know it's not an army if a young Indian girl with the baby's there, and she knew the language. She had great diplomatic skills, so she helps. It doesn't end so well for Sacagawea. Clark, by the way, Meriwether Lewis puts a gun in his mouth and blows off his head, commits suicide. Clark becomes the governor of Missouri Territory. Clark invites Sacagawea and her little baby boy to come live with him. She moves there, but she dies. But Clark adopts the little boy, he calls him Pompey, and raises her son, who lives a nice long life. So Sacagawea. I'm going to go real quickly now because I'm way behind time. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was from New York. She was an abolitionist, hated the institution of slavery, and devoted much of her life to it. In the year 1840, she gets married, and there were such things as honeymoons back then, but only for wealthy couples. The man she married had money. So he says, do you want to go on a honeymoon? She says, yes. She says, I heard that there's an anti-slavery convention in London. That's what I want to do for my honeymoon. So they boarded a ship and sailed all the way across the Atlantic. And they get there, and guess what? Women weren't allowed in, which is wrong so many different ways. So she's outside furious. While she's outside, angry that she can't get into the anti-slavery conference, she meets a very young black man who's there, former slave himself, named Frederick Douglass. And the two of them become fast friends, and they work with another woman named Lucretia Mott, a Quaker from Massachusetts. And in 1848, they set up the Seneca Falls Convention. 2-day convention in July at the Wesleyan Chapel, Seneca Falls, New York. And at that convention is when they argue and pass resolutions calling for women having the right to divorce, own property, inherit land, appear in court, and vote. Now, women at the time were seen as too sentimental, too emotional. So when Elizabeth Cady Stanton decides to write up their resolutions, she bases it on the Declaration of Independence, saying all men and women are created equal, and she calls it the Declaration of Sentiments, making fun of the criticism and owning it. I'll go real quickly and end this. Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, of course, was the great leader of the Underground Railroad, right, everybody? Harriet Tubman suffered a rough life as well. We're not sure if she was hit in the head by a brick or stone, or if a brick or stone was thrown at her and hit her in the head, but either way, she was hit. She was knocked unconscious, probably fractured her skull, probably had internal bleeding. And when she did, she would have these sort of colorful epileptic seizures with vivid dreams. Uh, so this tough life of hers in slavery. By the way, Harriet Tubman probably wasn't even 5 foot tall. Maybe didn't weigh a buck. She was petite, but she was tough. If Harriet Tubman and The Rock had a fight, my money would be on Harriet Tubman, no question. So Harriet Tubman was tough. So she had a vivid dream one time in one of these seizures, and God spoke to her in the dream and told her she was Moses, that she was supposed to let his people go. God didn't want his children, slaves, to suffer the bondage, human bondage of slavery. So Harriet Tubman runs away with brothers, but they get afraid and go back. She runs away and decides she's going to come back to try to get her husband out of slavery. He had already married another woman, so she left him. She then becomes a conductor for the Underground Railroad. There was no railroad, of course, it was a metaphor. The person leading people to freedom was the conductor. The path was the train tracks. If you had a safe house where you would hide, and they walked by night, hid by day, that would be called a train station. And they would put certain candles in certain windows. She had to know the route, know which candles and signals meant it was a safe house. Harriet Tubman would lead a group of about a dozen slaves by foot at night, being hunted by slave owners and dogs and bounty hunters and vigilantes, all the way to Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York to freedom. Then she would go back into the South and get another group, lead them to freedom, go back for another. She was wanted, dead or alive. There were posters of her with a handsome reward. So Harriet Tubman was brave, brave, brave. It's believed that she never lost a single passenger on those trips of freeing people. During the Civil War, she served as a scout and a spy for the Union Army because she knew the land in the South. On the right, you see a picture of her late in life. She became famous and she got money to tell her story. She used that to open up a home for old women long before Social Security or Medicare. So the great Harriet Tubman. I'm going to skip Jane Addams because I know I'm over time. I'll do 2 more. Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson is considered the mother of the environmental movement. Rachel Carson, a lot like Gertrude Elion, was a young woman who was very good in science, but she had trouble going to school and she couldn't get her PhD. She wanted to, and she wanted to become a professor, but no one would let a young woman get a PhD in science and no school would hire her. So she worked for the National Park Service. She did water conservation, and she was a prolific and a very accomplished writer. But then she discovered something when she was doing her research. We are a very chemically based society. We produce thousands of chemicals every year. And back in the early 60s, those chemicals were not regulated. And a lot of them were carcinogens. They caused cancer. But you know, this conservative capitalist idea, you can't regulate pesticides. So a lot of them cause cancer and we're still in the market. Insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, rodenticides, pesticides were being sprayed all on our agricultural crops without being checked. It turned out that a lot of those pesticides killed the animals that ingested them. The problem was the food chain. If you spray your crops, bugs get it. Then the birds or fish that eat them, then they get it. It gets passed up the food chain to us. She realized that there were entire species of birds that were threatened with extinction because the pesticides changed the composition of their eggs so the eggs wouldn't harden. And she identified 4 species of birds in her writing: the California condor, the largest bird, the peregrine falcon, the fastest, a pelican, a silly and cute bird, and the bald eagle. Our national symbol was going to go extinct. She wrote a book in 1962 called Silent Spring, where she argued that the birds are going to go extinct. She not only made an ecological web of life argument, but here's how enlightened she was. She made a philosophical argument, a metaphysical argument saying, what would the spring be if we didn't hear the song of birds? The sound of birds singing, it's good for the human condition. Well, she was laughed at by conservatives, business leaders, and others. She was seen as a joke. Unfortunately for her, she died right after that. But fortunately for all of us, her book became a bestseller and launched the modern environmental movement. This book ushers in the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, legislation to protect scenic rivers, and the first Earth Day in 1970. Last but not least, Charlotte Sorkine Noshpitz. She's the Harriet Tubman of the Holocaust. A lot of the leaders of the French resistance against the Nazis during World War II were Jews and Jewish women. She was a teenager at the time who was one of the leaders of the French resistance against the Nazis. And she would ultimately help dozens, if not hundreds, of Jewish children escape Nazi German territory. The image on the right. Do you all remember the old movie, The Longest Day? Anybody? Yeah, good. Sean Connery, Henry Fonda, John Wayne. I mean, probably the best cast of any movie ever made. It's a great D-Day story. I love the movie because I love D-Day and I thought it was a great cast. Red Buttons was in it, remember? The paratrooper. But if I had told my students Red Buttons, John Wayne, Sean Connery, and Henry Fonda, they would go, who? So I love the movie for another reason, and that was the opening scene with the girl on the right. I always thought she was incredibly good looking. When I was a young kid, that was my crush. So in the opening scene, there's a group of Jewish and French resistance fighters who are hiding weapons in hay in a wagon. And they're ready to move the weaponry, but here comes marching around the corner a group of Nazis. So they have to dive on the ground under the wagon and hide, and they're going to get caught. But along comes this beautiful girl on the right in a bicycle in a very short skirt. And when she sees what's going to happen, she purposely wrecks her bike, falls on the ground, and pulls her skirt up very high. All the Nazis run over to help her. While they're flirting with her, the resistance fighters run away and escape. That was a true story. And it was so inspiring that they decided to open up the Longest Day movie with that true story. Guess who the girl was in real life? Charlotte Sorkine Noshpitz. What she did was she would forge the papers. She forged her father's papers. He was a famous professor and helped him to escape. Her mother and other relatives got caught and killed in the Holocaust. She would forge the papers of young children and then at night, sort of like The Sound of Music kind of a thing, walk all the way to Switzerland. Or she would take them to Lisbon, Portugal, so they could escape Nazi territory. And after she did that, she'd go back and get more and more and more. She didn't have money, so she had to kind of talk shipping captains into taking these children. She had to talk the Swiss authorities and border authorities into letting people take them. She was so good looking. She was a sort of a young Raquel Welch at one point that she was able to talk every man into everything. I'm happy to tell you she lived through the war. She travels to New York for a psychology conference. She wants to be a psychologist. She meets a famous psychologist there named Noshpitz. They get married. She lives a long life. In fact, she only passed in 2017. So Charlotte Noshpitz, the Harriet Tubman of the Holocaust. And those are some of my heroines from history who were strong, brave, and impressive and made the world a better place. Thank you.